In September 2023, Richard Evans published an article in Genii magazine, an article with a new answer to the old question: who was S.W.Erdnase? Today I am really proud to have Richard Evans, a magician, historian and Erdnase hunter, as a guest on my channel. He will explain his new theory, which I must say is really amazing. By the way, I have published several videos on Erdnase on this channel, so I recommend you watch them before you watch this video if you are not really into Erdnase topic yet. So put on your detective hat and let's go on a journey of looking for Erdnase. My name is Alex Romanov, this is Art of Impossible. Let's begin. Hello Richard, and thank you so much for finding the time and being here with me today.
That's great, thanks. Well, I'm really grateful, Alex. Thanks for your interest, and it's great to meet you.
Before we get to the actual story of your candidate and your and Erdnase, maybe you could share a little bit with us a few words about yourself and your way in magic and
Sure.
magic history, maybe as well.
Yeah, sure. So, like most people, I've been interested in magic since I was a young kid, either with magic sets. I think I remember one of the first books that I had was I think it was probably a George Schindler book with instructions on things about how to make a silk tube or a silk box. I remember cutting up a cereal packet and painting it black. Absolutely dreadful. So that sort of thing, the usual routine. And then I sort of lost interest a bit, or I didn't continue with it until probably about 20 years ago. I know it's difficult to believe, that I could possibly be that old. And my interest really, my primary interest started with the 18th century and in Isaac Fawkes. I'd done some research on Isaac Fawkes that had been stimulated by Ricky Jay's work and by Eddie Dawes. And that's really where my interest in magic history started. And anybody who's done history knows that you sort of start picking at a thread and it unravels and it unravels and it unravels and you chase it down and chase it down. And it's an absolutely fascinating process. And since then, I've done various bits and pieces that have ranged largely through the 18th century, but a bit in Victorian times.
May I also ask, like, what's your what are you doing as a profession, as a job, or like what you've been doing before, or in which field do you work?
So I'm a doctor by profession. So I'm a hospital doctor, specialise in infectious diseases and internal medicine. And I've done that my entire career. So I've worked in the NHS, in the health service, in the National Health Service in the UK.
Do you remember the moment, or like what your interest with Erdnase? Did it start with the actually mystery of the author, or you just first got the book and read and studied it, or which one was that?
So I think it's the story rather than the book. I had tried to read the book. The book is really difficult to read, and I can't claim to be adept at much of what's in the book. But I guess, the interest in the book is both in terms of the mystery of the authorship, but also the high regard in which it's held. It's a really prominent book that greatest magicians of the 20th century have put it right up there as the greatest work on card manipulation ever written. And, people like Larry Jennings, Di Vernon saying, this couldn't be bettered. And then that whole mystery around, this guy, whoever wrote it and disappeared without a trace. And I think then it was it would have been probably the conversations on the Genii forum that sort of stimulated that interest. And like you described in the introduction, Alex, it's amazing that after 120 years, there's still people coming up with new ideas and new theories, and it's sort of things being thrown out there. And that's really what stimulated my interest in. Actually, it's not just a dead topic. It's actually one that it's not a done and dusted mystery solved. There's more to be found out.
Before we continue, let me just make a quick recap so we are on the same page. Expert at the Card Table is a book published in 1902 by someone under the pseudonym S.W.Erdnase. S.W.Erdnase is believed by most people to be an anagram, so the name of the author is most probably Andrews. Not a long time ago, Chris Vashbuha, magician, historian and owner of the wonderful resource library.com, published bankruptcy documents of the James McKinney and Company, the company that most probably printed the book. In these documents there was a name of Emily Cobb Andrews. The topic was not really developed, but Richard believed there might be something to be found about Emily Cobb Andrews, and it was worth it. So who was Emily Cobb Andrews? Someone who most probably had a very interesting double life. Continue watching to find out.
So with Emery Cobb Andrews, at face value, you could summarise his biography by saying that he was born in 1878. He was born and brought up, went to school in Chicago. He went to university briefly for a year to Princeton, but then came back to Chicago, finished his degree. But he was a chemist. He did a degree in science. And then after undertaking a few jobs in the industry as a chemist, ended up in the printing industry with a company called Philip Ruxton Incorporated. And he worked for them probably from about 1904, 1905 through to his death. And sadly, he took his own life in 1932. And that, I suppose, if you do an initial search of who was Emery Cobb Andrews and about him, that's the sum of it. He seems to be a businessman, a chemist, working in the printing industry, developed quite a name for himself. He became quite an expert in colour printing and particularly how inks were used in the printing industry, published a number of books and became quite prominent, quite well known. But that's where the story would end unless you start to unpick layers. And of course, the interesting thing, there's several interesting things about him in terms of the body of evidence that mounts up in his favour. The interesting thing, of course, is that most of what's known of him online about his adult life and particularly about his career is from that time, from about 1904, 1905, when he worked for Philip Ruxton in the printing industry. But if he was the author of The Expert at the Card Table, in 1902, he would have left university. And of course, what's more unusual about him than most other candidates, that means he would have been 24 years old. So he's much younger than has previously been supposed as the likely identity of Erdnase. Again, on face value, if you dig a little bit deeper into his university life in particular, he's quite straightforward. He seems sort of a typical student. He's but very active in the different societies in Chicago University. Very involved in the student publications, student newspapers, student magazines, student annuals, and a talented musician. He played about 5 or 6 different instruments: piano, mandolin, guitar. I think there's evidence later in his life: saxophone, clarinet. So quite a diverse range of instruments. Not just, it's not just the usual range of string instruments. He's into everything. And then I suppose working my way through that, and in terms of what you can find out about him, and particularly then, once you get through the initial bits about his adult life and his work in the printing industry, looking into him as a youth and as a student, I suppose, the question about the amount of time it takes and the depth of research, I ended up contacting Princeton and Chicago University just to see whether they had any of his academic records. And that took a long time because they're all boxed up in archives, and we were shortly after the pandemic and the libraries were closed down. But amazingly, after several months, those came through, and some interesting stuff came through, particularly about his biography from his Princeton alumni book, which he, and in that he wrote I think it was for the book in 1925, the 25th year. He made reference to the fact that in 1897, 1898, that he was engaged by the Secret Service to undertake work overlooking captured Spanish mail. So this was a slightly bizarre war. It was the Spanish-American War of 1898. It was very brief, only lasted a few days. But that thing, engaged by the Secret Service to look over captured Spanish mail, was just a really curious thing about why an 18-year-old would be doing that. So that was the first moment when I thought, hang on a second, there's more to this guy than might appear. But the real eureka moment then came, and it's amazing how much you can do online. So with the amount of millions of pages of newspaper that you can get online these days, there was an article in a newspaper called the Inter-Ocean in Chicago. I don't know the exact dates in the article, 1904, 1905, around about the time he joined Philip Ruxton, and he was in a gossip column. And it's a really strange place for him to be. There's not any real reason. But in the middle of a gossip column, it relates the story of Emery Cobb Andrews, and it sort of starts, who remembers Emery Cobb Andrews, when he was in Chicago University, this sort of, and it portrays him, because when you get the biographical information in black and white, it doesn't really tell you about the personality of the character of people. You just got it in front of you as to what they did, membership of associations. It's all quite flat. But of course, in the gossip column, it fleshes out some of his life, and it makes him a really interesting character as a young man, with lots of diverse interests. And two or three things in particular that were the eureka moment where actually there could well be more to this guy than meets the eye. It mentions times when he was a student when he needed money. So that's the first bell that goes off. This is a guy, there were times in his life where he needed money. And that he engaged in 3 schemes to make money, really. One was to rent chickens out to chicken farmers. The second was as a tour guide. And the third was as a Spanish translator. And what was interesting about these is if your interest rather in magic was in chicken farming in Illinois at the turn of the century, you wouldn't be looking to a chemistry graduate as a likely person to be renting chickens to farmers. So this was incongruous. It wasn't in keeping with what was apparently his personality from the biographies. It was a bit, it's completely incongruous. It's a bit of wild speculation on his part. So that was the first one. Second one is the tour guide. So he advertises himself as a tour guide, offering to undertake tours overseas for people. And the article says, incredibly, he offered himself as a tour guide, having never been abroad before, having never been to the places that he took people, but he looked as though he had, and he sounded as though he had, and he made money out of doing it, again, sort of this wild scheme. And again, little bell rings and says, so this is somebody who pretends to be something that he's not. So he's not been overseas. He's not a tour guide. He's not a tour expert. Pretends to be something that he's not. But not only that, is convincing. So he is pretending to be something that he's not, is convincing in doing so with the aim of making money. And the third thing, which is sort of, again, as I read through the article the first time I remember online, it references translating Spanish, which of course harks back to what we know from his biography that he wrote himself, that he was engaged by the Secret Service to look over captured Spanish mail. And the gossip column, what that says about him in this particular money-raising venture is that he was engaged to as a Spanish translator, but didn't speak a word of Spanish. That he was paid $1,500. He paid somebody else $500 to do the work and pocketed the $1,000 himself. So again, it's pretending to be something that he wasn't. It's really interesting as a personality. So at the age of 18 or 20, and it's highly likely that the 2 episodes link up the same, engaged by the Secret Service and the Spanish translation. It looks like an 18-year-old was willing to, I don't know whether it's fraud, but, scam the Secret Service out of $1,500 to do work that he couldn't do. So he becomes a much more interesting character as a result of that. And that was the eureka moment, really. I knew then that there was something possibly more to him than initially seemed the case. The elephant in the room, clearly with Emery Cobb Andrews, is that he's E.C.Andrews and not E.S.Andrews. And of course, that is the main puzzle up front, really, is, okay, great. As strong as the case may be in terms of his background and his personality, his name's wrong. And the other eureka moment with Emery Cobb Andrews was the realization that when you look at how he signed his name in handwriting. So when he signed his name in cursive writing as Emery Cobb Andrews, he signed his name in a number of different ways. He signed his name sometimes as Emery Cobb Andrews in full, sometimes as Emery C. Andrews, but most often as E.C.Andrews. When he, in his cursive handwriting, when he wrote when he wrote his name in full as Emery Cobb Andrews, the C in Cobb is a typical cursive C. It's a handwritten C. When he shortened his signature and he wrote his name signed his documents as E.C.Andrews, for some reason, there's a really peculiar flourish to his pen stroke on the C, and he writes it as an S. And it's clearly multiple times. It's not, couldn't be a C. It doesn't look anything like a C. It looks like an S.
Another important question is if Erdnase or Andrews actually was a card cheat.
And then if you look back at the book itself, in that section on card cheating, there are just a few things in there that are just incongruous. It's the, it's the fancy shuffles. There are things in there that realistically a gambler wouldn't really use. Not a gambler or a card cheat wouldn't practically use. And I think that's generally more well recognised that some of those techniques wouldn't really be practical at the card table, interesting as they may be. It's interesting when you look at people do sleights from that section of the book. If you imagine a group of people around a card table and they're taking it in turns to deal and they're passing the deck between each other, and it comes to one person to shuffle and they do some weird shuffle that looks completely unlike anything that anybody else has done, because it's almost certain that with some of those shuffles, the other players around the table wouldn't have done that. It would be quite noticeable, and you can see that just by watching people do some of those sleights, that it would have been incongruous at a card table, certainly in a card game.
And from this follows quite an unconventional answer to a question. Why would he use a pseudonym? Not really because he wanted to hide his identity as a gambler.
Why would people use a pseudonym? And I think that there's a whole variety of reasons through history why people used a false name. It's clearly the primary reason is to conceal your identity. Female authors used male names in order to get published. But for a book on card cheating or card technique, the most obvious thing is that the author would have wanted to protect their name from any reputational damage as the first thing. So this is maybe not something you want to be associated with in polite society. So that's the obvious reason. And traditionally and historically, the rationale for Erdnase using a pseudonym is that he was a card cheat, and therefore he didn't want people to know that he was a card cheat. That would affect his ability to play in games, and so reasonably knowing his identity would have been harmful to him. So the traditional way of thinking about the reason for the pseudonym is that using it or knowing his real name would have been harmful to him, his reputation, and or his ability to carry on cheating. Because Emery Cobb Andrews is so different, because he's he's this 24-year-old rather than what's historically been thought as somebody who may have been in his late 30s. It just occurred to me that the converse of that could have been true. And actually, the book was written from the perspective, the author was saying that he was a reformed card cheat. But if he wasn't a card cheat at all, and he was a 24-year-old, if people knew who the author was, it would clearly undermine the fact, well, the book hasn't been written by a card cheat at all. It's is this now a book of a limited value, reputationally for the book, for the book's credibility, for his likelihood of his primary aim, which is to get money. It undermines the book in a different way of knowing that he clearly wasn't a card cheat, as opposed to the historical and traditional way of us thinking of it is it hides his identity as a genuine card cheat.
Apart from the argument that Andrews was involved in some grey schemes and was a talented musician, which kind of tells us that he had some good digital dexterity, there is another finding which makes Richard's candidate stand out quite a bit. And this is something that all Erdnase hunters were attempting to do, to put a deck of cards in his hands. Richard managed to do that.
And then the last jump then was wondering whether I might be able to contact the family. And I'd known from one of the genealogy websites that that part of Emery's family history was there, but I hadn't been able to contact the family through that route, through the messaging system. But by pure chance, I then found an article in local press, and I was able to contact his grandson. He had two surviving grandsons. So Emery died in 1932, so they never knew their grandfather, sadly. But he had one grandson who was very interested in the family history, second grandson with less interest, but with some knowledge. And when I contacted them, there was a little moment again where there's that eureka moment when I said, I asked them whether or not, you have to ask these things very delicately, contacting a family whether or not their grandfather was a card cheat. But I said, was he interested in cards or interested in magic? The critical detail were the three things. Firstly, that he enjoyed playing cards. He had a regular card game with friends. Secondly, that he was remembered in the family as being a very skilled magician. And thirdly, a memory in the family that there was a story that he supposedly had a personal friendship with Houdini himself. And so those were the three details then, the sort of icing on the cake in terms of his candidacy.
Moreover, Richard managed to find quite a unique picture from a dinner where both Harry Houdini and Andrews were present. For those of you who want more details or want to see the picture, well, please get a copy of Genii magazine and enjoy the full version of the story.
So this was a dinner in 1922, the Chicago branch of the Society of American Magicians held a dinner in honor of Houdini. And there are two really nice details about that story. So they held a dinner for him after he'd performed in one of the theatres in Chicago. There's a very well-known photo of the banquet with everybody sitting around the banquet tables. And I was interested to see whether or not you could see Emery Cobb Andrews in the photo. Through various contacts, people were really, really helpful. I was able to get some high resolution scans and look towards the back of the room, and found there somebody who looks very much like Emery Cobb Andrews. I don't have his name having attended. There's unfortunately none of the photographs have. Be great if there was a photo where everybody attended had signed the back. But he's right at the back of the room. Somebody who looks very much like him. There's a photograph that he submitted for the Princeton Journal in 1925, so just a couple of years later. And when I showed that photo of the banquet to his grandson, he said words to the effect that would appear to be my grandfather. But, we can't say for certain whether it was him, but it's just that final little detail of it could well have been him at that banquet. And that banquet is really interesting for a second reason in terms of magic history, because it was at that banquet that Di Vernon, a very young Di Vernon, who was then still going by the name of David Verner, he was present as a representative of Sam from Ottawa. And he fooled Houdini and Houdini, who always said that he could figure out how a trick was done if he was shown it 3 times. Di Vernon showed him a trick, repeated it 6 or more times, and Houdini couldn't figure it out. And that was the night where Di Vernon made his name as the man who fooled Houdini. And it's just, I think it's a really nice ending to the story that Di Vernon, who idolised Erdnase, or idolised the book in particular, could well have been at that banquet in 1922 and showing that Houdini a trick 6 times with Erdnase watching on is just a fantastic end to the story.
One of the greatest things about Erdnase hunt is that it has no end. And so for Richard, this story and the research do not end here.
I'm still in discussion with the family because there may be something somewhere in an attic. There's nothing obvious, so there's no books. Emery didn't pass down his copy of Professor Hoffman of Modern Magic to his grandsons or anything like that. So there's nothing that they know of. The family believe that they do have some correspondence somewhere from him. They can't remember from whom. So I'm in discussion with them still, and there's still that prospect of maybe something that they've got will be, if there's a letter from Houdini in the attic or some correspondence between the two, that sort of thing. I'm still hopeful. The other thing I really like about research, and particularly about talking about it and publishing it, is that it might stimulate some thoughts with somebody else. They've seen something somewhere. There's so many, Houdini signed so many things and corresponded with so many people, and there are lots of collectors. There may well be a letter out there, and again, putting this information out there and asking that question might stimulate somebody to come forward and realise that, hang on a second, I've got a letter from an E.C.Andrews to Houdini. So we'll see. I'm really hopeful that something comes of it, and there's been lots of interest, and I'm really grateful for that. The interest that's been shown. It's been great talking about it.
Thank you so much for elaborating on each topic, and also thank you for your passion and being so really so passionate about this topic and spending so much time on that, because, and that's also what I guess for me is one of the fascinating things about the whole Erdnase story, that people really spend so much of their personal free time on this quest, which is the only purpose of which is just, you know, to know in the end. And it's just really pure. There is no second, you know, no hidden interest in that. Like it's really pure desire to uncover this mystery. And maybe it's because we're all magicians that we really can't can't stop when we have a secret in front of us. But I think it's really incredible. So yeah, thank you so much for contributing to that. And yeah, I will be definitely looking forward if you will get some new evidence. Maybe, who knows, maybe you will in the end get some information that they found the manuscript of the expert at the card table in the attic, and that will like puts the final
that would be great
dot in the whole story.
It's been my pleasure, Alex. It's been thanks ever so much for inviting me. It's been great to talk about it, and I'm really grateful for having been given that opportunity to do that. And I hope this is of interest to people, and that they pick up the article and have a read in more detail.
Absolutely, yes. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people will do that, and yeah, I will also. If anyone of the viewers has any questions or has some inquiries, then you can send me an email, and maybe we can get in touch with Richard directly, and then have an exchange, or maybe someone has more information.
I'd be really happy to do that. Send the queries in. I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't read the article yet, I highly recommend you doing it. Or just listen to Richard live at the session convention organized by The Vanishing Inc. in London in January 2024, where Richard will be a speaker. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe if you have not done that already, and let me know in the comments what do you think about this theory, and what do you think about Emily Cobb Andrews, and if he really was Erdnase. My name is Alex Romanov. This is The Art of Impossible. I will see you next time.